I'm watching on my phone. Everything is ready to go. I want to make sure everybody gets a chance to say hey to Will the Beast, Dr. Will Reilly, who works at KSU as a professor and as a badass author who recently wrote the book Taboo, and also talks about, I'll let you introduce yourself from there, man, because you're really, you do it, man. I love what you do.
Sure. Thanks for having me back on, Pete. I'm Will Reilly, Wilfred Reilly. I teach at Kentucky State University, and I've written a couple of books. One is Hate Crime Hoax, which looks at the phenomenon of kind of Jussie Smollett style fake hate incidents, which is something I'd be interested in talking to Dan or to Rep Crenshaw about. I've written Taboo, which looks at this cancel culture phenomenon, that things you're not supposed to say. And I also wrote a pretty much just scientific or methodological book called The $50 Million Question, which was originally my graduate dissertation. So I'm a teacher and writer, and do some other things in my spare time.
Do some other things in your spare time. I like it. What questions do you have for Dan besides the, we're going to talk about Corona, I'm assuming, right?
Yeah, I do have some Corona questions, and those aren't really political. Again, one of the things I teach at KSU is quantitative methods. So there's kind of a numbers emphasis. And something I'd like to see us do with COVID-19 is randomly test a large number of people so we can see what the actual infection rate and bluntly death rate are for the bug, for the disease. That's something that, as I understand, we haven't done. So I would be interested in to the extent he can talk about that, talking to Representative Crenshaw about that. Most of my other questions don't have anything to do with coronavirus, honestly. One of the most interesting things I think he said in the book, as someone who identifies as a Roman Stoic, is that outrage, this condition of being triggered, being very angry, showing your emotions on your sleeve, is an example of weakness. So I'd like to talk to him about that. I agree with that. And I think that most people who've had any sort of competitive background would agree with that. He says that he wants to assume the best of others. So I'd like to ask him some questions about when bipartisanship has worked. So yeah, I've got a lineup of about 8 or 10 questions. I read most of the book. I read that last night. Pretty good. I'd recommend Fortitude.
Yeah, it's a good book. I've read it also. You guys can buy it. There's links. And actually, when you click on my links, I get a nickel every time someone buys one. So if you want to make sure I get a shekel, it would be nice. But just in general, buy Dan's book. And he's doing a lot of pre-sales enticements. So we'll ask him about that when he comes on. But the book is strong because he makes just good, solid points. And you can argue about, whether or not he's right or wrong. But the point is he's just not wrong. There's a lot of Jordan Peterson, what he says, a lot of Jocko Willenick, and owning your own stuff. And look, everybody's got to struggle, but as a Stoic, if you don't let the external environment dissuade you from what you're doing to be the best you can be, you're pretty far along the way of the Stoic philosophy towards being successful.
Yeah, and I think that there's a very non-Stoic element to modern culture, which is what accounts for my first question. I mean, for thousands of years, people said that the best way to deal with fear was not to feel it. If you're going into a situation, battle, I assume would be the classic for humans, but leading a caravan somewhere, working on your masterpiece as a smith, you want to calmly assume victory while taking precautions. The worst possible thing you could do would be to go into that situation thinking, what if I fail? What if I collapse? What if I die? What if my family name is dishonored? So on. So, I mean, I think we've moved from that to constant introspection, thinking about thinking. And a lot of these books that are targeted, especially at sort of a young middle to upper middle class male audience, really get back to the basics. Like, unless I'm incorrect, one of the chapters of Jordan Peterson's book is called Clean Your Damn Room. And it's true. It's a valid point for young men. I mean, if you come into a filthy space where you have things laying on the ground, half-eaten food, not only are women not going to want to come back to that space with you, bluntly, but you're going to be miserable. You're going to be depressed. Like, one of the first rules of business, as asinine as this sounds, is to have a clean desk. I mean, have a box for the stuff you have to do the worst stuff in the morning. Hey, it looks like Dan Crenshaw's with us.
Dan is in the house, yes, while Will talks about cleaning up his book. Hey, Dan, this is Dr. Will Reilly. He's a professor at KSU, and you definitely will enjoy his jumping in as a co-host. But thanks for coming on the show, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, great to be with you guys. Thanks for having me.
Hey, we officially start every show off with you saying something like, hey, this is Dan Crenshaw, and you're listening to the Break It Down show. Can you give me one of those?
Sure. Ready, go. Hey, this is Congressman Dan Crenshaw. And, well, wait, let me get these glasses. Hey, this is Congressman Dan Crenshaw, and you're listening to the Break It Down Show.
So one of the things we do on the show is we have a lot of operators on, and what I like to do, Dan, is guys like us like to say, let's take the Letterman jacket off and let's get down to business and talk about who we are, where we are now. So we'll acknowledge that you're a SEAL, and if you want to talk about that and bring it up, great. Otherwise, those were the olden times. We're doing other things now. Obviously, you're up to big things. And the first thing I want to do is just from all of us out here in the U.S. is thank you and all of your peers for what you do. You've got an impossible job. You've got to manage a constituency. You've got to go deal in Congress. You got to get reelected every 2 years. I mean, the amount of work you must do every day. We had Representative Michael Waltz from Florida on the other day. He's a long tabber. And just he describing his day and his staff and how hard those guys work. Just all I can say is thank you to all of you. You know, all colors, all stripes, or whatever you are, wherever you guys are doing. It's a hard job, and I'm positive you don't get thanked enough for it.
Oh, you know what? We get thanked plenty, and we also get hated on plenty. So it's an interesting mix. It's an interesting mix, but it's you do it because there's a sense of purpose involved, and it's definitely a different kind of service. I never really viewed the military as service, and because I got to do what a little boy always dreamed of doing. You know, yeah, sure, you lose an eye every once in a while, but I never viewed it that way. It was more of an adventure, and I love everybody listening. If they're veterans, they know who Matt Best is from Black Rifle Coffee, and I always loved the title of his recent book, which was "Thank You for My Service." I thought that was the right way to look at our time in the SEAL teams, and I would also point out that there are some aspects of the military that do feel a lot more like service, like when somebody's stuck underwater for 90 days at a time. That feels like service, because that really is in service of strategic needs of the country, and it's hard to wrap your head around that when you're just a sailor in the submarine, you know, hundreds of feet underwater for months on end. Yeah. Yeah, so we're happy to do it. There's a sense of purpose there.
Yeah. Well, you're also, you know, when you go through that training too, you and your peers, there's someone always trying to drown you on purpose, trying to, you know, take you to the bottom and make it as hard as you can for you to get to the top, and just for getting drowned over and over again. I'm going to thank you for that as a service member, as a fellow combat guy.
I enjoyed that much less. I write about that in the book too. And what there's method behind that madness, and you're teaching people to problem solve in the worst of situations, and you learn some perspective, and you learn to what I call in chapter, I think 5, which is be still, and to learn to be still in the face of adversity and outrage.
Go ahead, Will.
Okay, I didn't know if I was going to open it up with questions. So first, Representative Crenshaw, I will say I'm not an operator; I'm a merchant. But thank you for your service. Everyone has a historical title, but thank you for your service. I mean, I think most Americans do feel that way. Moving into the questions, I mean, I read through the book. I've got a list of them here. But the one quote that stuck out to me actually is, and I think chapter 2 from Matt Taibbi, who's a bit to the left of Castro, but who I enjoy reading. And what he says is this gonzo journalism is cheap and easy. Even as a journalist, I don't know if we can get through this, because it's so much simpler to pull up your computer and pull up a Donald Trump tweet and write 1,200 words making fun of it and then link to him on Twitter than it is to go undercover in a Mexican maquiladora or do the things that journalists used to do. Do you see a way of getting through kind of this worthless clickbait on left and right? I think that's a major question that could affect whether we win wars or how the economy surges. I mean, how do we deal with that?
Well, what I point out is, well, first of all, I like that you note that I use examples from people who are way to the left. I quote Obama a couple times in the book because I do want this book to be readable to the left. I don't really get too political in the book until maybe towards the very end. And even then, I think I'm making arguments that liberals can read and not be offended by. And I really try hard to do that. So, and I also like to point out that liberals see this problem as well. And the solution to the problem, as I write about it, is there is an essence of personal responsibility here. I'm glad that writers like Matt have highlighted the problem. Many other writers have highlighted the problem as well. I spend a lot less time in this book highlighting the problem because all I need to do is reference others who have done that. We all know what the problem is. The question is, what is the solution? And the solution is you can't reward it. You know, as long as those incentives are there to make that kind of clickbait, and the incentive being people will click on it, they're going to keep doing it because there's a profit incentive there. So this book is written to regular Americans and saying, you have to stop clicking on it. And if you do click on it, it should just be for your it should just be so you can laugh about it, right? You don't actually believe it. Don't become that outraged person who lets a headline make them emotional. And that is the purpose of these headlines. They're written in an emotional way. There's a whole science behind it. We could Google this right now. What are the top headline clicks? And actually the number one by far is a phrase that says, "This will make you." And so whether it's this will make you feel happy, right? Because it's like a picture of a puppy. This will make you angry, like, so people click on that. And I'm not saying don't use that. I'll use that sometimes in my videos, but I also try to put a lot of substance behind my videos, and content. But it's not so much that that's the wrong, like, people shouldn't use that headline. I'm not suggesting that, and that would be frankly unreasonable and unrealistic. What I'm suggesting to people is that understand what it is they're trying to do to you, and just don't be that person, okay? Because I think the next chapter is about being your own hero, and the first step in all of this is to choose to be somebody who lives with fortitude, choose to be somebody who isn't outraged, choose to be somebody who isn't triggered. And it's kind of like drafting a vision board. And once you choose to be that person, then I give you a set of lessons on how to do that.
Right now, we're going through a really challenging time. Clearly, there's a lot of uncertainty. Again, guys like us who've been to conflict zones, we deal with uncertainty a little better than a lot of people because just been in it more. But right now, folks, day to day, work, supplies, just out of their groove. There's so much uncertainty. From the point of view of your book, how do folks deal with this unknown of what's next? 2 weeks, 3 months, a year, how long this stays? It's frightening for folks.
It is, and it's bewildering for a lot of veterans, because I follow a lot of veterans, and there's lots of different ways to think about the coronavirus response and how dangerous it really is. You see vast different opinions across the board, and there's plenty of people out there who are way more concerned about the economic devastation, understandably so, and think we're overreacting. And there's some people who would have us locked down in place forever. If it meant saving some lives. And so you got to find a balance between those two. And I definitely note that veterans, especially ones who have combat experience, are scratching their heads like, guys, this is a risk just like any other risk. Why don't we confront it? Let's mitigate it. Let's figure this out. Frankly, I think that is a healthy response to how to think about this. And so, I guess the chapter in my book that really hits that point is the chapter on perspective. And it's one of the first chapters, and I tell the story of me getting blown up and the kind of perspective that gives me, the kind of perspective my mother gave me as she battled cancer and eventually lost that battle when I was 10. And the point is this: somebody else has had it worse than you. There's always something harder, and it behooves you to think about it in that term. It doesn't mean you have to go through a hardship yourself, and if you do, think of it as a blessing. Tell the right story about that hardship and become stronger for it. But you don't necessarily have to. Again, I don't say that you have to live through some kind of grief. You shouldn't wish that upon yourself. But guess what? Most of us have. And there's a right way to think about that. And there's a right perspective gained from that. And so the veteran community certainly has that perspective because we have confronted risk head on. We've this kind of disingenuous question that's asked about the coronavirus often, which is how many lives is it worth to save one job? Okay, you keep hearing that. Veterans have heard that question for a long time. And we know it's a dishonest question. We know it's not really a good faith question, because we could easily say, well, it's not really worth our guys' lives to go outside the wire and conduct this mission. I don't care who that bad guy is. It's just not worth a single life of my American colleague. And yeah, in a very black and white sense, that's true. If there was a choice between bad guy and my buddy, obviously I'm going to choose my buddy. But that's not really the right way to think about it. We have a mission to do, and we have to mitigate risk as we conduct that mission. And this isn't really that different in the coronavirus setting, because we are at war, and our mission is to continue to live our lives. That's our mission, fundamentally. Now, how we do that requires some mitigation of risk and perseverance and perspective. And so that's where that chapter comes into play. It would have been nice to write this. Maybe I'll do a version 2, coronavirus version. But frankly, by the time that thing comes out, everybody would be so sick of hearing about coronavirus that it would probably fail, and deservedly so.
If I can ask one sort of practical question about coronavirus, from your perspective, Representative Crenshaw, you're a congressman. Are we planning on doing sort of large random testing for coronavirus in the U.S. population? Is that something or can talk about? And as a bit of intro, when you mention there are many estimates about how dangerous coronavirus is, as someone coming from the scientific community, that's true to a shocking degree. We've seen estimates that range from a lethality rate of 0.06% up to 4%. Stanford University, some of their top stats guys recently came out with a piece that I think we've all read in the Wall Street Journal, where they said that there's what they called the denominator issue. So we know all of the deaths from coronavirus. My understanding is that even some probable flu fatalities are now being tested. We know that number. That's a high. That's a disturbing number. The issue is that we don't know the number of cases. So when they've done randomized large-scale tests in other stable countries, Iceland, they found that 7% of the population had at some point been infected with coronavirus. I believe Italy, they tested in the Vaud region, 3% at that time had coronavirus. These are well done tests, private industry, very few false positives. Is that something we're going to do here? Because when we talk about flattening the curve, when we think about, can we go back to work? Can we bring our employees back to work? A big element of that practically seems to be, what's the curve we have to flatten? We seem to be assuming a very high death rate. We're looking at that London paper that to some extent shut down the world. That was 1% to 2%, I believe. If it turns out that's not correct, then what we're doing might not be ideal. So as a representative, is that something that's planned? Are we going to look, for example, at one of these battleships with a fairly high rate of infection and say, okay, as horrible as it is to discuss this is the number of people that are sick in America, 5% or whatever. This is the number that will die. Is that something we're working on?
Yeah, it certainly is. And that is correct. The whole point of temporary social distancing and these lockdowns that we're experiencing is to let our supply chain catch up to that. Supply chain meaning number of ventilators, testing, mass testing, the ability to contact trace, and the ability to maybe increase the number of hospital beds, because there's two competing realities here. One is that the death rate might be exceptionally small, but even if it is exceptionally small, it doesn't change the other fact and the other reality, which is that our hospital system can be quickly overrun, because one way this is different from the flu, it would appear, is that it's just more contagious.
Yep.
And there's no vaccine, and we're not exactly sure yet if we build immunity to it. I really hope that's the case. That would make things a lot easier, because then you can mass test for immunity and then basically get these people back to work and on the front lines. You've already had it, you're good to go. So there's a mobilization that needs to occur rapidly, and so that we can move from risk containment to risk mitigation.
Yep. Yeah, and if I can add just one more thing there, personally, it would seem very important that there are two sorts of testing that might be useful. One is what you mentioned, which is testing for antibodies. Who's had the disease and is good to go now? If we're just looking at rates of infection, that needs to be random. That's one of the points that if you go through the sort of methods community online, pretty much everyone is saying, these terrifying death tolls that we're seeing right now, 2%, 4%, those come out of the pool of very symptomatic, mostly senior individuals that have been allowed to go in and take a test. So, I mean, for a good buddy of mine, anecdotal evidence is worthless, but one case recently contacted the doctor, said, I've got a rasping cough. I'm a blue collar guy. I think that might be this. The doctor just said, stay home. We really don't have enough tests for adult male athletes and such to come in and take them. So we're looking at a very narrow pool of the sickest people, and that's where the death rate is 2%. If you take a random sample on, for example, I believe it's the Roosevelt that had an outbreak of infections, you're going to find what the actual rate is. And that's when we can decide what the curve we need to flatten is, it would seem. In terms of number of ICU bids, there's going to be a different number of ICU bids needed if the potential death rate is 0.1% as versus 1% as versus 5%, which a tech entrepreneur named Pueo argued in a very influential piece. I don't think that's realistic at all. So hopefully that's something we'll do.
Yeah, I mean, and it's really just, it's a supply chain issue. It really is the number one goal of federal government, is to really mobilize our supply chains to create more testing, because the people kind of misinterpret what the purpose is of testing. One purpose is to get better data. That is helpful, but frankly, I think the purpose of testing is more helpful when it's routine and done in mass. Because that specifically allows us to get our economy back up and running. Because think of it this way: if testing was widely available, you could test every restaurant employee, get them working right away. Okay, and you can say everybody in here is tested negative, and then you can do it again the next day. They were just tested yesterday; they were tested negative. That's how you get the economy back up and running. And so it's mobilizing towards that is enormous. Knowing the data is true. Yeah, you bring up some good points about what is the curve
that
ever
sets
look
the curve.
Like? And well, it sets the curve, but also we can never prove a counterfactual on the curve. So it's useful to think about, but you can only plan so much off of it. We do know some certain realities, which is that hospitals get overrun rather quickly. So we do know we have to increase hospital beds. By how much, that's always going to be unclear. But we do know that the number needs to be higher. And so that's a good place to start. Because again, my main goal is getting people back to their normal lives in society. We have to balance that out better. And it's just indefinite lockdowns are an impossible future to deal with.
Yeah. I wanted to bring up one, Robert Owens. I don't know if you know Rob at all, Dan. He is the fittest 66-year-old man in the world. He went through Mark Devine's pre-buds course and passed it as a 66-year-old. He just went through COVID, and him and his wife survived it. And obviously, they're in their late 60s. I wanted to throw a shout out to Rob just because he's such an awesome badass dude. He was a pararescue guy. So, but the question with all of this is, and Will's a great resource. One of the things I love that he does, he tries to bring some numbers and some data driven, puts his PhD hat on, it helps us understand this crisis. And one of the things we've seen in New York is that the death rate, if you're relatively healthy and below the age of 65, the death rate is not 1 or 2%. It's 0.2% or whatever. It's very, very small. And granted, these numbers change and everything, but you guys are dealing with a big, hairy problem. It seems like day to day, the information is changing. You're trying to make tactical decisions and pass laws and legislate and appropriate and all those things that you have to do. But also talk a little bit about the strategic view of how do we balance saving lives in a way that allows us not to crater our, not that it can get any more cratered, but without destroying the economy. And then how do we tease the economy back into, it was roaring. Now, and everybody's freaked out. Like, it's just 1919 all over again, even though basically no one was alive from back then. Can you talk a little bit about that link between tactics and strategy and you guys are working on?
Yeah. Well, it's a bit of summary of what we've just been talking about. So we passed a bill that provides capital and fuel for the economy in the span of about 2 months. Okay. So there's some strategy behind that. We want to keep employees attached to their places of business, both small and large, for a period of about 8 weeks. That's about what $2 trillion might accomplish. We might need even more than that. But the reality is we don't have any more money. Okay, from the public standpoint, modern monetary theory is not a real thing. We can't just keep spending another $2 trillion. So we have to be getting our economy back up and running and functioning within the next 1 to 2 months. And in order to do that, we have to simultaneously mobilize mask production, PPE production, testing production, antibody testing production, ventilators, and hospital beds. So there's an enormous mobilization that has to happen. We're already doing it. We need to keep doing it, double down on that. And so that's at the federal government side, helping organize those supply chains, making sure that that gets everywhere. And then on the state and local side, you got to manage that. You got to manage the testing, and you've got to have reasonable timelines for people. We have to be strong enough leaders to actually say, here's the timeline. We're sticking to it. We're sticking to it. And we're preparing on the back end, our public health side, which was underprepared before. It always will be for a pandemic. That's just the nature of things. You can blame everybody you want. That's nonsense. It's just, you got hit by the natural disaster. You can't prepare for that necessarily. But now that we're preparing on the back end, we're giving ourselves some time by social distancing. And so I want our leaders to outline that plan a little bit better, because people are losing their minds not knowing what the timeline is. And you have to have a timeline. It might vary from state to state. I get that. The problem is listen, these leaders are putting out timelines, like Dallas just said, May 20th. But people are scratching their heads and they're like, May 20th, really? We don't have that many cases. In Houston, our increase in cases is very small. I mean, it's barely bigger than the day before. Sometimes it's actually smaller. So it seems it's really hard for people to swallow this. That in New York, that makes more sense. They might be on lockdown for 60 more days. I get it, but it's got to be smart and balanced in each location. And domestic travel is probably out of the question for a couple months, because again, if Texas is doing just fine but New York isn't, well, obviously you don't want people flying from New York to Texas. That seems obvious, unless they've been tested, right? And so unless they've been tested and have antibodies, right? So you can make exceptions, and public policy has to be able to be nimble enough to make those exceptions and work accordingly. Maybe we need a better apparatus at each airport so that we can allow domestic travel. So there's ways to adapt to make sure that our economy can exist simultaneously next to the fight against the pandemic.
Can I get you two guys to talk about, Dan, in your book, you talk about racial crimes that are hoaxes, and this actually happens to be an area where Will is a published author, and so I'd like you guys to discuss that, because it's integral to what you're talking about in society, and I guess I could say that to the both of you. So please discuss.
So, the reason I bring up any of those cases wasn't so much I don't really deep dive into the nature of race crime hoaxes, but the reason I bring them up as examples is because of my discussion about victimhood ideology and how we've elevated the archetype of the victim to an exceptional degree in our society, to where like we've changed out heroes for victims. We look up to these victims and we elevate them. They're like, wow, that's the person I want to be. I want to be that person who was victimized. And that seems very strange to me. And the examples I use are kind of the obvious ones. Jussie Smollett. I use Elizabeth Warren as an example, right? She's highlighting these instances of victimhood, and they turn out to be lies, and that's the worst part. But why I analyze why people lie about this. And the reason why is because our society has begun to elevate victimhood, as opposed to elevate people who overcome things, as opposed to elevating people who live with fortitude and say, hey, they tried to do this to me, but I overcame it, and I pulled myself up and I made it work. That's the kind of person we used to elevate as a hero, but we've totally changed our hero archetypes that we actually look up to. That's sort of the premise for that discussion.
Yeah, no, I think that's pretty much correct. As Pete mentioned, I wrote the book Hate Crime Hoax, which looks at a collection of several hundred of these kind of cases that you're describing. So, I mean, Jussie Smollett, but also in that same year, you had Covington Catholic, if you want to count that as a hate hoax. I mean, you had the Congresswoman Erica Thomas, that might be at the state level, but who claimed a brutal racial attack in a Publix grocery store, slurs, push, so on. You had the dreadlock cutting case in D.C. I put together a list of about 1,000 of these by this point,
Wow.
concentrated within the past 5 years. So it's a book of social science. I mean, as you said, it's published by a center-right press, Regnery, but it's not an extraordinarily political book. The question is, why the hell are people doing this? And what I find is something pretty similar to what you're saying. Gad Saad, the social psychologist, calls it collective Munchausen syndrome. We reward people that seem to be unusual, different, suffering. So just as when we rewarded, bravery, you're going to see people pursue the thing that produces the reward.
Yeah.
One of the things that was crazy about Hoax, the book, is that a huge number of these cases, almost the majority, took place on college campuses. So however you want to define that, colleges, universities, elite senior prep schools, that was something like 1/3 of the whole data set. And what you saw with those cases wasn't that the college, patted someone on the back and then sent them to the police station. It was this massive celebratory reaction. There'd be parades, rallies, so on. So yeah, I mean, as long as you tell people that if they have been hurt or abused, they're going to be not just treated honorably but rewarded. Yeah, you're gonna see some of these cases. Not much more to say there, but
no, it's true. And the victimhood ideology narrative, it's a theme throughout my book. I could have written a whole book about that, and that's each chapter in my book. I think maybe not every chapter, but a lot of them you could write a whole book about. And and I tried not to spend too much time on the problem. Obviously, I have to, because you got to explain the problem to explain the solutions. But the solution to the victimhood narrative was the hero archetype narrative, and so I try to bring up pretty obvious things. I think people know this stuff intuitively. I like the study of psychology because it's really a study of things that we already know intuitively, but it's just put into smart people words. And that's true. And so I'm not a PhD, but
there are a lot of dumbass PhDs, man. I mean, that's not necessarily a negative.
Yeah.
There was not all to jump in, but there was a hoax recently where a couple of social scientists who I'm casual friends with at the Twitter follow level wrote a bunch of fake papers, and they submitted them to the top journals in social science. One of them was just a chapter of Mein Kampf, and it went to a journal specializing in liberal politics. One was a piece about fat bodybuilding. So, I mean, having an IQ above 120 doesn't mean you have any practical experience in life, I will say.
Yeah, I heard about that. That was one of the better stories out there. That was great. And those guys weren't really, as I recall, I remember them talking about, I don't recall that they were even very conservative.
No.
They were just concerned about the institution of academia, and rightfully so. And they proved their case pretty well. But yeah, I mean, the counter to the victimhood hero is the real hero, and it behooves us to remind ourselves of what real heroes actually look like and the attributes that they possess. And again, a lot of my book is also very practical, and so a large part of that chapter on heroism is not just the problem with how we view hero archetypes versus victimhood archetypes, but also just how to improve yourself along a specific societal hierarchy. And I think hierarchies are a useful way to think about that. There's a lot of different hierarchies that we try to improve ourselves within. Sometimes it's like, okay, you want to be better at sports. Well, there's a hierarchy there. Okay, you have to improve this much to get up to this level and this level. Same with business. Maybe you're good at social connections, and you're good along the social hierarchy. Like, everybody has something they have strengths at or want to have better strengths at. And so I tell people to imagine the people who do well in the places that you want to do well at, and copy them. Just copy their attributes. Like, it's really simple. And I know, like, examples from my own life and we've been doing this since we were in high school. Like, you see popular kids and you see the way they act, and like that kind of changes how you act, because you're like, wow, well, they're doing something and they're rewarded for it. And people like them. People are attracted to them. What are they doing? Okay, I noticed that's how that person reacted to this. Maybe I should react that way to that. We do this as children, then we do it as adults, and we have to. And so in the SEAL teams, I would notice the way certain leaders would react, and how certain SEALs would act, and what kind of respect that garnered them. Well, then you just mimic that. Okay, so there's that aspect to it. And of course we get into the conversation about people mimicking the wrong attributes,
Yes.
which is what you were just referring to, and this reward that is given to the wrong attributes in our society. And so there's very individualistic lessons in my book, but there's much larger cultural takeaways as well, as far as like, as a culture, who the hell are we actually looking up to? You know, like, we shouldn't look up to some of these people. These are not good people. But we do it anyway, and we've got to remind ourselves of what the right classical heroic attributes really are.
Yeah, you're talking a little bit about the stoicism that guys like us seem to all share, you know, and then the outcome of someone like Greta Thunberg, and God bless, you know, it's great that she's here's a funny note about Greta is, if you translate her name, this is a bad translation, but basically it's Pearl from Tuna Mountain. It makes her name a lot.
Really?
That's legit. That's what Greta Thunberg means. But you know, she's doing things. She's got a voice, but the voice is paper thin. You know, if I'm gonna be honest.
Yeah. Same with, like,
you bring this up in your book.
Yeah. I compare her achievements to another young kid named Boyan Slat, who you know, he actually created something. He actually created this big thing that cleans up plastic in the ocean. It's awesome.
Right.
You know, he's gotten all these investors to invest in it, and then you can do an objective comparison here as far as just a Google search and how many search results each one gives back. And you know, at the time of the writing, I can't remember what it was, but Greta had in the bazillions, and he had like 500,000. Okay, not bad. It's not bad to have 500,000, but still not very many. And even though objectively speaking, he is much more impressive than Greta, who knows nothing and only hurls angry slogans. But we have become a society that rewards passion over substance, and that seems backwards. You know, I talk about like the meme culture, and again, I'll share memes. Memes are cool. Yeah. I just think that we shouldn't value them so much over a well-written op-ed, and we shouldn't value an op-ed over actual journalism. And we shouldn't even necessarily value journalism over a think tank piece that is actually substantively backed up. But nobody reads any of those things. You know, people read the memes, and it's great if that meme is correct. But as a society, we have to take a step back and think, okay, wait, maybe I shouldn't put all my eggs into that basket. Like, maybe I should use this for entertainment, but for my learning, I should use this. You know, that's all I'm saying. I don't want to go like hate on memes. You know, that's not the point. Because man, I have a lot of friends who make really funny memes, but they're so mad at me. But you know, it's a matter of reward, and individual Americans are the only one who can control that reward. And this book is written for individual Americans.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Will.
Yeah, one thing that comes up for me when you bring up some of this, like the reliance on quote unquote thin-intelligent figures, people that sound like they have something to say, but perhaps not really that much, meme culture, comic culture, a bit of decadence. One of the things that I think a lot of political scientists or historians would say is that these are general characteristics of rich societies. Stoicism began to fade in later Rome when the emperors started throwing orgies in their palaces. The number of centurions dropped 95% near the end of the society. I mean, these are actual facts. And that seems to tie into some of the things you mentioned in your book. Like you say, when I was in Afghanistan, I never heard anyone mention microaggressions. You know, people wore the same clothing most of the year. I've observed this myself in the third world. And this used to be our standard of wealth in the USA, right? You had one set of clothes to wear, one to wash, one for Sunday. That was it. You know, family gun and saber by the fireplace. That was your wealth. I guess where I'm going with this is there a way for a society as wealthy and coddled as ours to overcome this problem? I mean, I'm kind of softballing into the book here because you give a couple. But how do wealthy societies with no kind of classic initiation rites avoid this?
You read chapter 8, which is a chapter titled "Do Something Hard," because
best chapter.
Yeah, and you can also read the chapters on perspective, because but really what you're describing is a loss of perspective that a rich society and a very comfortable society where we've done our best to remove suffering in every aspect of our lives. And it's something we can celebrate also, but we also have to be honest about the consequences of that. And do something hard is a chapter that is quite literally about doing something hard. Now, it's a much deeper discussion than that because I go into the psychology of doing hard things. I go into the religious aspects of doing hard things. Like there's a much deeper conversation to be had there, and you have to read the book to understand it. But it really is also as simple as pick stuff that is hard and do it. Now, not hard for like me. I'm not saying go through buds. I talk about buds as like my kind of awakening. I understand that not everybody can do buds. We mentioned Mike Waltz before. That guy can't do buds. Okay, right. He's in the Army. Just sorry, Mike. I'm just gonna jab at my Green Beret brethren there a little bit. But but the point is that it has to be harder than other stuff you've done. All right. And it has to be habitual and it has to be self-imposed suffering. I'm not saying go swim with sharks. That would be hard. Like that would be suffering of some sort, like getting bitten by a shark. Don't do that. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying go swim a mile, right? Because maybe you've never done it before. I'm not saying go do it alone. You should probably have some kind of safety mechanisms, but like do something that you really didn't think you could do. Okay. Take a cold shower in the morning. The Stoics talked about this. They talked about this kind of self-imposed suffering, and more in a sense of preparedness. Like they would say, "Hey, sleep on the floor. Understand what it's like to not have the comforts of your home every once in a while, so that when it happens, it's not mentally devastating to you." So there's two aspects to suffering, which is one, it's a preparedness issue in a very practical sense, but in a deeper way, it builds character. It builds hope. I mean, the Bible talks about this. I quote the Bible in this book a lot, actually, because nothing I talk about in this book is new. Actually, that's why I bring up the Bible. That's why I bring up ancient Stoics, because it tends to be true that if ideas have been around for a very long time, it tends to mean that they are true. Yeah. And we simply need to remind ourselves of them and then translate them into kind of a more modern conversation.
One of the things when you talk about perspective, and I'm so glad you brought up chapter 8, making my job easy. But among other things, you're starving, you're in buds, you're working out to the point of failure over and over again, relying on teammates who are having the same thing done. And then you get served an MRE, which in normal fashion, in modern times, they don't taste all that bad, but like you don't get a heater with it, and it's just one more thing. And it's part of that grinding that you have to go through to do the kind of things that we've done. Another thing I like to add a lot of times too is when people talk about the 1%, think about this. You can get tacos any time of the day, anywhere in America. Like you can always get tacos. That's not true in Germany. And I say tacos, any kind of food. You go on a Sunday afternoon and places are closed. We poop in potable water. I mean, it's scope back your camera, and then all of a sudden you realize we are all so wonderfully fortunate. That perspective, Dan, it's huge.
It is. And I talk about the beauty of America as a sense of perspective quite a bit.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about your podcast. First off, I wanted to say this too. One of the things I love about what you've done, why I've always wanted to have you on the show, is you talk candidly about the day-to-day, like we just voted on this. Here's why I voted the way I voted. That kind of transparency, I think, is invaluable because we just don't know. All we know is that we don't like you guys. And congressional ratings are so low as a group, right? But here you are saying, here's my position. Here's what was in the bill. Here's why I didn't like it. Like I think back to 2008 during the last time we had a stimulus package, and a lot of the representatives and Congress folks were saying, we don't read these bills. Who's got time for that?
Yeah.
Well, that's how Congress wound up with a lower approval rating than herpes last year. It was like 11 to 9. But yeah, I mean, good to see individual reps boosting that, dog.
Yeah, lately it's actually been quite good, mostly because we just voted to give everybody money. But the media was actually, this was a poll that I wrote about recently we did a podcast on it. That's what it was. The media is at an all-time low, deservedly so. I think they've been atrocious throughout this entire coronavirus. When you have these so-called journalists in the White House press briefings, just there to ask gotcha questions. There's no seeking out of information. And again, they're a big part of the problem. I talk about them in the book a lot as well. They drive this outrage culture. They just repeat the other side's talking points as a form of a question. And it's done in bad faith. And this is not the time for it. You know, we're in a true war against a pandemic, and it's just not the time for it. This is the time for the media to remember who they actually are supposed to be, which is people that inform other people. It's a very simple, that's a very, very simple goal and mission, and they should adhere to it for once.
Talk a little bit about your podcast in general. I mean, obviously you're already doing the IGTV videos, but talk about Hold These Truths.
Yeah, it's the greatest podcast ever. Everybody should download it and give it 5 stars.
That's true.
So the way I started that podcast was, you know, I get to have a lot of interesting conversations in Congress. I get access to interesting people, smart people. And so I might as well just have a conversation with them and record it. It really is that simple. We've been putting a lot more effort into it recently because, you know, we're not in session, and I've got a little bit more time trying to bring some different aspects about how to think about coronavirus into it. I think yesterday I released an episode which just gives a timeline debunking the bad faith arguments against the president that, you know, he's responsible for the deaths of thousands of Americans. I mean, it's just, you can't imagine a worse thing to say about somebody. And so I just point out how, like, in excruciating detail, what everybody was saying throughout January and February, and what actions the administration was taking throughout that time. You know, one really prominent note is that when the Democrats lost their minds because Trump had the audacity to only ask for $2.5 billion, this was the first package, the first time any Democrats in Congress that I recall really made a big deal out of it, and they were just really mad because the president didn't ask for enough money. To which he responded, "Okay, fine, give me more money. Like, what are you guys doing?" But we didn't even vote on it that week. You know, they went through all of that pearl clutching. We didn't even vote on it. What they did put on the floor was a bill to ban flavored tobacco. That was their big thing. So, like, no more Grizzly Wintergreen, so that's or no more Copenhagen Wintergreen. Just to all our veterans out there who are listening, would be really pissed off. I mean, this is so, it just that's the kind of things you can expect from it. It's a deep dive because I was missing the deep dive into policy in my messaging. You know, I can write about it to a certain extent, but I wanted to be able to interview experts on things, because the videos, they're a few minutes long. I hit the highlights. I moved past the talking points in those, which is really why people like them. It's not so much that I'm unveiling what's happening. Everybody can look up what's happening and what we vote on. What they miss is the actual explanation. And I think that's what I try to deliver in those Here's the Truth videos, is an actual explanation that is it's not too deep, but it's deeper than the talking points. Okay. And that's, people just want to feel like there's some kind of honesty there.
Will?
Oh, all right. I've got a couple written here. So let's see. All right. I guess actually I'll go with a positive question. So one of the things you say throughout the book, and I've heard you say on your podcast as well, is that there's a negative tendency right now to assume that the other man, the person you're debating, is an inherently bad individual. People say things like Trump is getting people killed, AOC would get people killed. And you say, I think, assume the best of others, assume the steel man. Can you give an example, as opposed to some of the things we've been talking about, can you give an example of Congress really working together along bipartisan lines to do something good that people can kind of learn from, that followers of the political process can take from?
Yeah, it's getting worse and worse, isn't it? I mean,
I was going to say, if the answer is no, I mean, that's...
Well, no, there's examples. I mean, the recent bill was bipartisan. Not a single senator voted against it. It's unclear. I would have loved to see us actually vote on it that day. You know, Tom Massey got up there and almost made us do it. We might as well have done it. We had a quorum, because I would have liked to see, frankly. You know, I know Tom Massey might have voted against it. That's fine. That's his prerogative. I wanted to see what Democrats would vote against it. But the point is, because AOC was all against it, so would love to see her vote no. But my point is, though, it was overwhelmingly favored by both sides. So it was negotiated in good faith. There was many days of very bad faith, and I was very outspoken about that. I will never let the American people forget that while we shed millions of jobs, the Democrats stalled that bill for no good reason. I mean, and that is the ultimate truth. There was no good reason. They listed this huge list of crazy things to add into it, and eventually it went basically back to the way it was, with a few minor changes that easily could have been agreed to that previous weekend. Millions lost their jobs every single day while that happened, and I will never forgive that. And so, but it was still bipartisan in the end. And every Monday, listen, if this was normal times, every Monday or Tuesday, whenever we fly in, it's bipartisan legislation day. Basically, we suspend the rules. They're called suspension votes. And these aren't huge pieces of legislation, but they can be meaningful. They're just things that we agree on. We don't need to debate it. We just get it on the floor and vote on it. So that happens every week.
That's interesting, actually, and that we obviously, and this is true in the law as well, which is part of my background. I mean, when you think of the Supreme Court, you think of these huge contested cases dealing with, for example, abortion, so on. The majority of the cases that come before the court, and in some ways the most important cases that come before the court, deal with things like use of public lands and their 9-0 votes. So it's interesting to hear that same perspective from someone that's sitting in the House. That's interesting and valuable. One thing I will ask, kind of swinging from that to some of the things that the Democrats, and to a lesser but real extent the Republicans, tried to put in the coronavirus bill. Do you think that there are people using the coronavirus crisis to try to push an agenda or to try to dramatically change the USA? That's something that seems to be almost accepted in internet discussion. I'd be interested in hearing an actual political leader's perspective on it. I mean, do you think that people are going to try to shove through UBI, for example, or a temporary nationalization of some sectors to respond to coronavirus, quote unquote?
Well, they said they would, and they did. So, yes, I mean, that was the majority whip, Clyburn. He was quoted as saying this. This is an opportunity to implement our vision, and then they came out with this list of like 10 or 15 just really crazy progressive items that had nothing to do with coronavirus. They continue to say that. They continue to talk about green infrastructure as the next fourth package. So yeah, of course. I mean, they're not hiding the ball here. They're just saying it, and Americans have to be cognitive enough to say, "Oh, wait a second, no, absolutely not. This isn't responsible. This doesn't have anything to do with our fight against this pandemic." But Democrats are masters of manipulation, just absolute masters of it, and it's sad to see, but it's true. As far as Republicans, let me try and think of some maybe ways Republicans might try and do that. I mean, I would think the only things we might do is say, hey, maybe these deregulatory measures that we're taking to get things going, why don't we keep those? Like that would probably be something I would push for. But I would argue that's a lot less impactful in a negative way than some of the actions that Democrats want to take. So, saying the government will do less stuff from now on is a bit less serious than saying the government should have entirely new infrastructure programs or entitlements from here on out.
I like to ask this question whenever we have folks from Congress on. Is we're not a bimodal society, as much as the media tries to portray that. We're some kind of shitty bell curve. So that means most of us are somewhere in the middle. When you look ahead, and let's take Corona out of this because it's such a distracting thing, but when you look ahead at the big things you think Congress can do that are truly bipartisan, not like one person votes with you, but like this is an important thing we're all going to do, and this is going to make our nation better. What are some of those things? And then who do you respect from the left that you see you're like, you know what, we may disagree politically, but I'm behind that person because I know that they're working, they're a good person. They're doing their best.
Well, I can certainly be friends with a lot of my colleagues. There's just some good, I like Tulsi. She's a good person. I like Joe Kennedy. Is a good person. As far as getting behind them politically, no, almost never. Just because we really are so far apart. But right. But we can have good conversations, and we can say, hey, what would your people say if we tried this out? And they would say, well, they would react this way. And I can give him the same kind of insights into how conservatives would argue that. And so that it's useful to have those friendships just to potentially negotiate something out. Your other question was basically, well, what are you guys going to negotiate out? What are some big things you can solve?
Right.
And geez, I could go down a long list. I mean, can I throw that question back at you? And like, give me an issue that maybe you want me to comment on. Maybe one of the big ones, and I can tell you kind of because they're all different dynamics. That's the thing. Like they're all. Let me generalize it this way.
Okay.
You can compromise if you have the same goals. Okay. You can't compromise if you don't have the same goals. You have to win. And so the unfortunate reality is that I think we've moved away from having the same goals in many of these big controversial areas like immigration or healthcare. The reality is that on immigration, we don't have the same goals anymore. I think we used to, but I think when every single policy that the Democrats want to implement results in more illegal immigration, not less, we don't have the same goals anymore. So you can't compromise with somebody who has a totally different goal. You just have to win. If your goal is to have better healthcare, more accessible healthcare for people, but you just want to go about it different ways, you can kind of imagine some ways to compromise. And there are, I can't imagine some ways, maybe not the entire system, as long as they don't want to upend the entire system with Medicare for all. I think there's ways to compromise. But the problem is they keep moving the goalposts, and so like there's no compromising on Medicare for all, and that's a problem. But other things like poverty reduction, you can imagine a lot more compromises in a thing like poverty reduction. Again, but the problem here is Democrats they only want to talk about inequality, so it becomes less about poverty reduction and more about punishing the wealthy. And like I'm just like, okay, I mean, why can't we just focus on the thing we agree on and poverty reduction? Like there's good ways to do that. And frankly, our current system is a bit of a compromise with poverty reduction. Like we have a safety net, but we have some work requirements that we try to put in there. I would argue that's compromising. We would, of course, want to keep streamlining that process, and they'll fight back against us for who knows what reasons. But those are some general ways to think about it.
Fair enough. One, actually, I just got a question from Twitter as regarding immigration. Can you ask Representative Crenshaw what his immigration policy is and whether he still supports most immigration as long as it's legal? So, I mean, I guess the question from that is, what would your ideal immigration policy look like? Have recent events changed that at all? And what do you think a barrier to compromise from the political left would be there?
Well, I'll put it in simple terms. Zero tolerance on illegal immigration. We truly lock down the border, and then we can have the conversation about a more streamlined legal immigration system that is based on merit as opposed to familial connections, which is what people refer to as chain migration. So that's a very general answer. At that point, once you've solved those two things, because I'm willing to have a conversation about a more streamlined version of work visas, for instance, too. I mean, I talked to a lot of construction companies. Of course, this was back before the economy took an incredible nosedive. So the conversation's changed a little bit, and then you have to figure out what to do with the potentially 20 million people who are here undocumented. That's a much harder conversation for conservatives to have. And they can only have it when they think that we've actually plugged the leak. Okay, well, then they can have that conversation. And I think restitution might be an option there for basically, well, here's generally what I think.
Yeah.
If you've committed a crime other than your visa overstay or crossing the border illegally, I have zero tolerance for that. ICE should deport you. If you haven't committed any crimes, if you've just been here working, we can't deport 15, 20 million people. That's not feasible. And so conservatives have to like recognize that fact. And then what do we do with it? Well, people want to still feel a sense of justice. They don't want them to have citizenship and vote. And they also feel like they should pay some kind of restitution. And I think that's a perfectly fair way to look at it for basically what would be a non-citizen residency. So that's way down the road once you've actually secured the border and figured out the more pressing problems first. So that's going to be my general take on immigration. The barriers to that compromise are very simple. The Democrats want more illegal immigration. And that didn't always used to be the case, right? That was not the case just a few years ago. That was not the case under the Obama administration. But it is the case now. And that's just the truth. That's what I see from my colleagues. Every single policy that they wanted to put forth was designed to create more illegal immigrants, like 100%. And so I don't know how to compromise with that.
Yeah, I will say just very quickly, because I think Pete has a question, but I was surprised by the quick shift of the tenor of that conversation about immigration myself. In my most recent book, Taboo, I outlined what I thought was a very sane, non-racist immigration policy that some policymakers have asked me about. And I think basically it was to enter the United States, you have to show that you are sane, non-criminal. In most cases, what I said, healthy. You could discuss able-bodied, but no plague-form diseases. And that you're able to get a job. And there are a lot of ways to do that, from an employer letter to an H-1B to an IQ test. So I basically said sane, non-criminal, healthy, and employable. And this was the most controversial thing I said in the book. I've been asked to discuss it 20 or 30 times. I've been called prejudiced against the mentally ill. People have criticized the policymakers that read the book and suggested that this be done. So what do you think has accounted for this shift toward what 5 years ago, 10 years ago, Mr. Obama or Mr. Bush would have thought of as an insane immigration policy? Why is there what does sometimes seem to be advocacy for illegal entry? What do you think the reason for that is? And that's my last immigration question.
Because of Trump, and because the left hates Trump, and the left doesn't have principles. So the left has never had any kind of principled approach to any problem. It's for them, it's about winning. They just need to win. And so they're going to manipulate however they need to win, and they're going to be against whatever their enemy is for. And so because Trump is this is the biggest enemy they've ever had, they need to win against that. And so that's why they've devolved into those arguments, even though it's unclear whether they believe them themselves. It's unclear what they believed a few years ago. These things have changed. And the other aspect of that is what we talked about before, the elevation of victimhood, right? They would rather, they don't want heroes in our society. They want victims, because they can control victims, and you can tell people that you're a victim. It's part of their identity politics mantra. And that identity politics and victimhood obsession has materialized much more recently. So I think it's a combination of both of those things. It's an unprincipled approach to problem solving, because they don't have principles. And if you think they do, tell me what they are. But generally what they say is, well, they're fighting for inequality and injustice. Okay, well, those are goals, and they're laudable. I'm glad people are out there doing that, but they're not governing principles. They never will be. There's no limiting principle to that. There's no framework with which to approach a problem, and so that's part of it. And when you don't have those foundational principles guiding how you think, then it's very easy to switch really rapidly in an opportunistic fashion in order to win. So that's what I can apply that reasoning to basically most things that they say and do.
So I just have one more question for you, and everybody needs to get out and buy Fortitude. Get it pre-sales. The book is fantastic. Will and I have both read it. It's you will definitely appreciate what it is. And when you buy the book on Amazon, here's the key. What you do, you go 5 stars and just put a simple review in there. You can tell a joke. It don't matter. But that's money for the authors. That's how you get their book to be discoverable and get them over the hump. So rate and review. It's essential. Hey, so Dan, as a operator, you're always trying to do your best. You're leaning forward on problems. I think we would all give you a high mark for your first couple of years here in Congress. I'll give you an A. People were ecstatic that you were coming on the show. That's a hallmark and a KPI that you're doing good things. When you evaluate yourself, though, where do you I've got to improve this, or I really want to put effort here? How do you critique yourself?
Good question. In typical SEAL fashion, we're just like, well, we're great at everything. So hard to say, but no, actually we self-critique the worst out of anybody. So I just, frankly, instead of trying to do introspection too often, because that's always biased, I just listen. I make sure that I'm open, that I allow the people around me to be diverse in the way they think. Like, for instance, everybody on my team in the district and in DC who's in a leadership position is a woman. My wife is also a woman, as it turns out, and she is not shy about telling me her opinion on everything. And so you just, I kind of purposefully set myself up for combative relationships so that I hear different perspectives and can act accordingly. And just because you don't always know when you're screwing up. And if you think you do, then, well, you can't, I think you're just naturally biased towards thinking that you're doing it right. And so you kind of need to set up the people around you to help you think through that. And then, and try not to be too much of a jerk when they confront you about it. I think that's the important thing. And so I guess, but on a more practical level, what can we do to improve? I mean, I'll just tell you my goals. My goal is to get on energy and commerce because I want to improve our national energy strategy, right? And then because, well, my oil and gas industry here in Houston is going through a devastating time. I think our messaging around healthcare and the environment as Republicans can be improved drastically. We've got to work on that. I've got to work on getting to the people in the middle who don't like people fighting, right? They're not really sure what they believe or how to think about certain policies. They just know they don't like people fighting and yelling at each other. Okay, let's do a better job reaching them and not just talk to our audience. So those are a few things that we can always be improving on, I think.
Man, I appreciate you coming on. Do you want to ask Will or I any questions? We've been hammering you for an hour.
No, I'm good. I appreciate it. I'm late for another interview, but 40 minutes late. It's okay. This was a fun conversation. And I really appreciate the shout outs for the book.
Yeah, everybody get Dan's book. It's called Fortitude. He's awesome. And I appreciate you guys for coming on the show today. Hey, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good day, guys.